July 14th, 1943. The outskirts of Palermo, Sicily. The dust never settled anymore. Every American shell kicked up another cloud. Every German retreat left another crater. The war had come to Sicily like a storm, and Capitano Stefano Marelli watched it from behind the wheel of a broken-down Fiat 508 Coloniale, the pride of Italian military engineering, now spewing black smoke and refusing to climb even the gentlest hill. "She's done," muttered Tenente Franco Bassetti, the unit's mechanic, a thin man from Turin with oil permanently stained under his fingernails. "Third transmission this month." Stefano didn't answer. He was watching something else, a cloud of dust moving fast along the coastal road, too fast to be Italian, too aggressive to be civilian. Through his binoculars, he saw it. A boxy, olive-green vehicle, moving like it owned the road. 4 Americans inside, laughing, one of them drinking from a canteen. They moved at a speed that seemed impossible for anything on 4 wheels in this terrain. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. "What is that?" Franco whispered. "That," Stefano said slowly, "is what we've been hearing about. The Jeep. The Americans had landed 3 days ago. Already, their machines were everywhere. Tanks that didn't break down, planes that arrived in waves, and these strange little vehicles that moved like gazelles while Italian trucks groaned like dying elephants." Franco's eyes widened. "Captain, what if we—" Stefano cut him off. "Tonight." By midnight, 8 Italian soldiers crouched in an olive grove near an American supply depot. The plan was desperate, possibly suicidal, but Stefano had learned that desperation was all they had left. The Germans were retreating north, the island was collapsing, and Rome was silent. But if they could take one of those jeeps, study it, understand it, maybe they could learn something. Maybe they could build something better before the war took everything. The American guards were tired, rotating shifts slowly. When the generator failed at 2:15 in the morning, plunging half the depot into darkness, Stefano and his men moved like shadows. The jeep sat there, hood still warm, keys in the ignition. Franco slid behind the wheel, his hands trembling. "I've never driven anything like this." "Then learn fast," Stefano hissed. The engine turned over, smooth, powerful, nothing like the tortured coughing of Italian motors. Franco eased it forward, no lights, rolling through the darkness. Behind them, American voices shouted. A flare burst overhead. "Go!" Stefano roared. Franco slammed the accelerator. The jeep leaped forward like it had been waiting its whole life for this moment. They tore through the countryside, the wind screaming past, the speedometer climbing. 40, 50, 55 kilometers per hour on a dirt road that would have shaken an Italian vehicle apart. When they finally stopped, deep in the hills near Enna, Franco sat there, breathing hard, hands still gripping the wheel. "Captain," he said quietly, "this changes everything." For 3 days afterward, Franco Bassetti and his team of mechanics disassembled the captured jeep like surgeons performing an autopsy on a marvel. They measured every component, sketched every angle, studied the engine that produced 60 horsepower from its 2.2-litre inline-4 design. It was simple, accessible, designed for field repair. Franco compared it to the Italian engines he knew by heart. "They stripped away everything unnecessary," he murmured. "No elegance, no style, just function." Stefano stood watching. "Can we copy it?" Franco looked up, his face grave. "Captain, we can copy the shape, we can copy the idea, but this requires steel we don't have, manufacturing precision our factories can't match anymore, and tooling that's probably been bombed to rubble." "Try anyway," Stefano said. They sourced parts from 3 broken Fiat trucks, a destroyed German motorcycle, and a civilian car abandoned in Catania. The chassis was welded by hand, the suspension adapted from drawings, the engine, A Fiat 1.1-litre four-cylinder was the best they could salvage. By July 28th, they had something that looked like a Jeep. It sat in the barn, smaller, rougher, clearly Italian in its improvisation. Franco turned the key. The engine coughed, sputtered, then caught with a thin, reedy sound, nothing like the American roar. The test came the next morning. Franco drove while Stefano watched the speedometer climb, 20, 30, 35 kilometers per hour. Then it stopped climbing. The engine screamed, black smoke poured from the exhaust, but the needle wouldn't move. The camionetta slowed, and halfway up, it began to roll, backward. Franco sat behind the wheel, tears streaming down his face, not from sadness but from pure, impotent rage. "We copied everything," he said hoarsely. "Every measurement, every angle. But we can't match the heart of it. That American Jeep could do 100 kilometers per hour. Ours can barely do 35. The Americans were advancing. Most Italian units had surrendered. But in a limestone cave in the hills, they hid their creation, wrapped in canvas, along with detailed plans documenting every lesson learned, every failure, every desperate attempt to build something worthy with nothing but scrap metal and hope. The workshop was a converted barn outside Caltanissetta, hidden from American air patrols by ancient cork oak trees. For 3 days, Franco Bassetti and his team of 5 mechanics, men pulled from various broken units, disassembled the captured Jeep like surgeons performing an autopsy on a marvel. Every bolt, every wire, every weld was examined with the kind of reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts. These men knew they were witnessing something extraordinary, a machine that represented everything Italian engineering aspired to be but couldn't achieve under the crushing weight of a collapsing nation. Sergeant Giovanni, called Gianni, Torrisi was a former Fiat factory worker from Milan. His hands, calloused and strong, ran along the chassis with the gentle touch of a craftsman who understood the language of metal. "Look at this welding," he said, his voice carrying both admiration and frustration. "Clean, simple, strong. We make everything too complicated." It was a confession as much as an observation. Years of building elaborate vehicles for a market that valued aesthetics over function had trained Italian engineers to add flourishes where Americans added strength. The Jeep's welds were brutally efficient, each one placed exactly where it needed to be, nothing more, nothing less. Corporal Pietro Vella, the youngest of the team, at 19, measured the wheelbase with a carpenter's tape measure, one of the few precision tools they still had. His young face was intense with concentration as he called out measurements that Franco recorded in a worn notebook. "It's shorter than our Coloniale," Pietro observed, running his hand along the frame, "but the ground clearance is higher. See, they designed it for rough terrain from the start." It was a revelation. The Italian vehicles had been adaptations of civilian cars, modified for military use as an afterthought. The Jeep was born for war, conceived and built with a single purpose: to move soldiers and supplies across any terrain, in any condition, without failure. But it was the engine that made Franco go quiet. The Willys Go Devil, a 2.2-litre inline-4 that produced 60 horsepower. It sat in the frame like a beating heart, simple, accessible, every component designed for field repair. Franco had spent years memorizing Fiat engine diagrams, understanding the intricate dance of Italian engineering. This American engine was different. It was almost crude in its simplicity, yet that simplicity was its genius. A soldier with basic tools could repair it in the field. An Italian engine required a factory, specialists, parts that no longer existed. They stripped away everything unnecessary, Franco murmured, more to himself than to the others. No elegance, no style, just function. His fingers traced the valve cover, feeling the roughness of cast iron that would never win a design award but would run for thousands of kilometers without complaint. Italian engines were works of art, beautiful machines that purred like contented cats when properly maintained. This American engine was a workhorse, designed to be beaten, abused, and to keep running anyway. Stefano stood in the doorway, watching his men work. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the barn floor, and somewhere in the distance he could hear the rumble of artillery. The war was getting closer. "Can we copy it?" he asked, though he already suspected the answer. Franco looked up, his face grave with the weight of impossible truths. "Captain, we can copy the shape, we can copy the idea, but this—" He touched the engine block with something close to reverence. "This requires steel we don't have, manufacturing precision our factories can't match anymore, and tooling that's probably been bombed to rubble." It was the reality of Italy in 1943. The factories that remained were producing at a fraction of their capacity, starved of materials, running on equipment from the previous war. The Americans had factories in Detroit working 3 shifts, churning out vehicles by the thousands. Italy had craftsmen in barns, trying to forge miracles from scrap. "Try anyway," Stefano said. It wasn't an order, it was a plea. Outside, the war was accelerating with the terrible momentum of avalanche. The Americans had taken Palermo on July 22nd, parading through streets that had once cheered for Mussolini. The British were pushing through the southeast, their tanks grinding forward with mechanical inevitability. German units were evacuating across the Strait of Messina, pulling back to the mainland with the disciplined efficiency that had made them feared across Europe. And Italian divisions were dissolving like sugar in rain, some surrendering with relief, some deserting to go home to farms and families, some simply walking away from a war they no longer understood or believed in. But in that barn, 8 men worked with the intensity of monks copying sacred texts. They sketched every angle, measured every dimension, photographed what they could with an ancient camera that took precious minutes between shots. Franco drafted designs by candlelight, his hands moving with desperate precision across pages of graph paper. Each drawing was a prayer, a hope that somehow, impossibly, they could recreate American industrial might with Italian ingenuity and determination. "We'll call it the Camionetta Veloce," Stefano decided one evening as they sat around a small fire, eating bread and cheese that tasted like dust. The fast truck. The name was aspirational, almost defiant. They all knew what they were building wouldn't be fast, but naming it gave the project dignity, transformed it from a desperate gamble into something purposeful. Gianni laughed bitterly, the sound harsh in the quiet barn. "Fast. With what we have, it'll be lucky to roll." But even as he said it, his hands were already sketching modifications to the suspension, trying to coax performance from inferior materials through clever design. They sourced parts from 3 broken Fiat trucks found abandoned on the road to Enna, their crews either captured or fled. A destroyed German motorcycle, its rider dead in a ditch, provided gears and chain. A civilian car abandoned in Catania, its owner probably escaped to the mainland, gave them a steering mechanism. The chassis was welded by hand, sparks flying in the darkness as Gianni worked through the nights. The suspension was adapted from Franco's drawings, springs stretched and modified to approximate the American design. The engine, a Fiat 1.1-litre 4-cylinder, was the best they could salvage. It had perhaps 40 horsepower on a good day, 2/3 the power of the American original, and Franco knew it would have to work twice as hard to move even a lighter vehicle. Pietro worked through the nights, his young face hollowed by exhaustion and something else, a desperate need to prove that Italian hands could build something worthy, even as everything fell apart around them. He was too young to remember Italy before the war, before the bombast and promises. For him, this Jeep copy was a chance to show that Italians were more than the defeats and surrenders that filled the newspapers. By July 28th, they had something that looked like a Jeep. It sat in the barn, smaller than the original, rougher, clearly Italian in its improvisation. The steering wheel came from a bus. The seats were wooden planks covered with canvas salvaged from a tent. The tyres were mismatched, borrowed from vehicles that had served different purposes. But it had 4 wheels, a frame, an engine, and the shape of possibility. Franco turned the key with a trembling hand. The engine coughed, sputtered, protested like a sick animal, then caught. A thin, reedy sound, nothing like the confident American roar. But it was running. The 8 men stood there in the barn, listening to that imperfect engine, and for a moment they allowed themselves to hope. Stefano climbed in, settling into the makeshift seat. "Let's see what she can do," he said. The road outside Caltanissetta stretched empty in the early morning, a ribbon of cracked asphalt cutting through wheat fields that had gone unharvested for 2 seasons. To the north, smoke rose from American bombing runs, thick black columns that stained the sky like ink spreading through water. To the east, the sound of artillery was constant, like distant thunder that never stopped, a low rumble that had become so familiar the men barely noticed it anymore. But this morning, in the pale light of dawn, 8 Italian soldiers were about to test whether their desperate gamble had any chance of success. Franco drove first. His hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white with tension, as he settled into the makeshift seat of the camionetta veloce. The vehicle rattled and shook even before he engaged the clutch, every weld protesting, every bolt vibrating with uncertainty. Stefano sat beside him, one hand braced against the dashboard, the other holding a stopwatch borrowed from a doctor's abandoned clinic. Behind them, Pietro and Gianni waited in an old Fiat truck, ready to follow and document what they all hoped would be a triumph. Franco took a deep breath, whispered a prayer to a god he wasn't sure he believed in anymore, and pushed the accelerator to the floor. The camionetta lurched forward with all the grace of a wounded animal. The engine screamed, a high-pitched wail that spoke of metal pushed beyond its design limits. Franco worked the gears, feeling the transmission grind with each shift, but the vehicle was moving, actually moving under its own power. The speedometer climbed, 20 kilometers per hour, then 30, then 35. Franco's heart lifted for a moment, but then the needle stopped climbing. He pushed the accelerator harder, as if force of will could somehow extract more power from the straining engine. Black smoke poured from the exhaust, thick and acrid, the smell of burning oil filling the morning air. The needle wouldn't move beyond 35. "More throttle!" Stefano shouted over the noise, though he could see Franco's foot was already pressed flat against the floor. "There is no more!" Franco yelled back, his voice cracking with frustration. "She's giving everything." And it was true. The Fiat engine, never designed to move a vehicle of this weight at speed, was running at maximum capacity. Every piston was firing, every valve opening and closing in desperate rhythm, but there was simply no more power to be extracted. The American Jeep they'd captured could reach 100 kilometers per hour on a good road. This Italian copy could barely manage 35, and even that felt like it might tear the vehicle apart. They reached a hill, a gentle slope that looked almost trivial in the morning light. Franco had watched the American Jeep climb a steeper grade without even slowing down, the engine note barely changing as it powered up and over. But the camionetta was different. As soon as the road began to rise, the vehicle slowed. Franco downshifted, the gears grinding in protest. The engine screamed louder, the black smoke became a thick cloud, and halfway up the gentle slope, the forward momentum died, completely. For a moment, the camionetta sat there, suspended in futility. Then, with terrible inevitability, it began to roll backward. Franco slammed the brakes, the vehicle jerking to a stop. They sat there, engine still running but going nowhere, the mechanical ticking of overheated metal the only sound besides their own harsh breathing. The smell of burning oil was overwhelming now, mixed with something else, the acrid stench of a clutch being burned away. Stefano looked at Franco, and in that look passed all the unspoken disappointment, all the crushed hopes of 3 weeks of desperate work. Pietro, following in the Fiat truck, pulled alongside. His face was stricken, the expression of a young man watching his heroes fail. "Captain?" he called out, his voice small and uncertain. Stefano climbed out without answering. He walked to the back of the camionetta, placed both hands against the hot metal of the rear panel, and pushed. Gianni joined him, then two other soldiers who'd been riding in the truck. Together, they shoved the camionetta over the crest of the hill, their boots slipping on the asphalt, muscles straining against the dead weight of Italian ambition that couldn't quite match American reality. Franco sat behind the wheel through all of this, tears streaming down his face. They weren't tears of sadness, not exactly. They were tears of rage, pure, impotent rage at a situation that no amount of skill or dedication could overcome. His hands still gripped the steering wheel, and he realized he was squeezing so hard his fingers had gone numb. "We copied everything," he said hoarsely, speaking to no one in particular, to everyone, to the universe itself, every measurement, every angle, every weld, every component. His voice broke. "But we can't match the heart of it. That American Jeep could do 100 kilometers per hour. Ours can barely do 35. Stefano leaned against the vehicle, feeling its heat through his uniform. The metal was almost too hot to touch, another sign of an engine running beyond its limits. "It's not your fault," he said quietly. "Then whose fault is it?" Franco snapped, turning to face his captain with wild eyes. "Whose fault? Who decided Italy would go to war with trucks held together by wire and prayers? Who thought we could fight America with 1920s engines and factory equipment from the last century?" The questions hung in the air, rhetorical but devastating. Who convinced us we were ready for modern war when our military ran on gasoline engines designed before most of us were born? No one answered. Because they all knew. The fault belonged to politicians who'd promised empire while starving the factories, to generals who'd ordered offensives without understanding logistics, to a system that valued appearances over substance, propaganda over preparation. The fault was systemic, generational, the accumulated weight of decades of decisions made by men who'd never had to face the consequences of their choices. Gianni spoke quietly, his voice thoughtful despite the disappointment. "The Americans, they built this for war. Every rivet, every bolt, every measurement was designed with combat in mind." He ran his hand along the camionetta's frame. "We built beautiful cars for rich Romans to drive to the opera. Elegant machines that looked magnificent parked outside La Scala. There's your difference. They made tools. We made art." Pietro kicked the tire in frustration, the gesture of a young man who still believed the world should make sense. "So what was the point? Why did we even try?" His voice carried all the confusion of youth confronting futility. "We spent 3 weeks, used parts from a dozen vehicles, worked day and night, and for what? To build something that can't even climb a hill?" Stefano looked at the young man. Really looked at him. Pietro was 19 years old, born into a world that had promised him glory and delivered only grinding defeat. He deserved an answer, even if it wouldn't satisfy. "Because trying is all we have left," Stefano said. "Because the alternative is to give up, to surrender not just the war but the idea that Italian hands can build anything of value." He gestured at the camionetta. "Yes, it fails. Yes, it can't match what the Americans build, but we built it anyway. We tried, and that matters." Franco wiped his eyes, leaving streaks of oil and tears across his face. He looked at their creation, this flawed, inadequate vehicle that represented everything they'd hoped for and couldn't achieve. "Does it?" he asked. "Does it really matter?" The question hung in the morning air as the distant artillery continued its endless thunder. August 3rd, 1943. The Americans were now 10 kilometers away. The distance that had once felt like a buffer, like safety, had evaporated overnight. The sound of their tanks was no longer distant, no longer something that could be ignored or dismissed. It was immediate, mechanical, inevitable. The deep rumble of Sherman engines carried across the Sicilian valleys, a sound that spoke of overwhelming force and unstoppable momentum. Most Italian units had already surrendered or fled, their commanders making quiet calculations about survival versus honor. The Germans were systematically destroying everything they couldn't take with them: roads, bridges, fuel depots, leaving scorched earth for the advancing Allies. Demolition charges echoed through the hills, each explosion a punctuation mark in the story of retreat. In the barn outside Caltanissetta, Franco Bassetti made a decision. He stood alone for a moment, staring at the camionetta veloce in the dim morning light. Then he turned to the others and spoke 3 words that changed everything. "We're not giving it to them," he said. Stefano looked at the camionetta, their failed copy, their impossible dream. The vehicle sat there in the shadows, covered in dust and oil stains, a monument to ambition that couldn't quite match reality. "What do you mean?" he asked, though something in Franco's tone told him exactly what was coming. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I mean, the Americans will find it, study it, and laugh at how pathetic it is. Franco's voice was tight with emotion barely controlled. Some intelligence officer will write a report. He'll type it up on clean white paper in some office far from here. The report will say, Italians attempted to copy our Jeep, failed completely. Inferior in every way. And that report will be filed somewhere, in some cabinet in Washington, and years from now, historians will read it while researching their books about the war. And they'll laugh too. They'll use it as another example of Italian incompetence, another joke about how we couldn't match American industry. He pulled out a jerry can of gasoline, the metal container sloshing with liquid that could erase 3 weeks of work in minutes. "I won't let them mock what we tried to do," he said, his voice breaking on the last word. Gianni stepped forward, his hand outstretched. "Franco, wait." But Franco wasn't finished. "We built this with scrap metal and hope." His voice cracked, years of frustration and disappointment pouring out. "Every weld, every bolt, we put our souls into this because it was all we had. We worked through the nights while the war fell apart around us, while our government lied and told us we were winning, while our generals retreated and abandoned entire armies, while our factories burned under Allied bombs. We tried to make something that worked. We tried to prove that Italian hands could still build, could still create, could still matter. And I'll be damned if I let it become a joke for American engineers to chuckle about over their morning coffee." Stefano moved quickly, grabbing Franco's arm before he could unscrew the cap of the jerrycan. "Stop," he said firmly. Franco turned, wild-eyed, face streaked with tears and dust. "Why? Give me one good reason why." "Because it's not a failure." Stefano's voice was quiet but firm, carrying the authority of a man who'd learned leadership in the hardest school imaginable. "It's proof." "Proof of what? That we can't compete?" Franco's laugh was bitter, almost hysterical. "That we're second-rate? That everything they say about us is true?" "Proof that we tried." Stefano held Franco's gaze. "Proof that even when everything was falling apart, when the war was lost, when our country was being invaded and our army was surrendering, Italian hands still knew how to build. Not as well as the Americans, I'll grant you that. Not as fast, not with the same resources or the same precision. But we built. We took an enemy vehicle, studied it with nothing but basic tools and determination, and we created something. And that matters." Franco's hands shook, the jerry can trembling in his grip. "Does it? Does it really matter? Who will remember? Who will care that 8 men in a barn tried to copy a Jeep and failed?" "We will," Pietro said suddenly. The young man, just 19 years old, stepped forward from where he'd been standing in the shadows. He reached out and touched the hood of the camionetta, his hand gentle, almost reverent. I'll remember that we didn't give up, that we looked at something impossible and tried anyway. that we refused to surrender to despair, even when despair was the only rational choice. He looked at Franco with eyes that had aged years in the past weeks. My children. If I survive to have children, they'll ask me what I did in the war, and I could tell them I surrendered. I could tell them I ran. I could tell them I gave up. But instead, I'll tell them about 8 men in a barn who tried to build a miracle out of scrap metal. Maybe we failed, but at least we tried. Franco sank to his knees, the strength draining out of him. The jerry can slipped from his hands and hit the dirt floor with a dull thud. He put his face in his hands and wept, great shaking sobs that came from somewhere deep inside, from a place where hope and despair had been fighting for weeks. Gianni picked up the jerry can silently, unscrewed the cap, and carefully poured the gasoline back into storage. Waste was still waste, even in defeat. Stefano made his decision. We hide it, he said. We bury the plans. And someday, when this war is over and Italy rebuilds, someone will find what we did and learn from it. They'll learn what worked and what didn't. They'll learn from our mistakes. And maybe they'll also learn that trying matters, even when success seems impossible. They worked through the night, working with the same intensity they'd brought to building the camionetta. They wrapped it in canvas, layer after layer, protecting it from moisture and decay. 8 men pushed and pulled the vehicle, rolling it on its mismatched tires through the darkness, up into the hills where limestone caves pocked the mountainside. They chose a deep cave, one that would be difficult to find, and pushed the camionetta into the shadows. Franco created a detailed technical manual, working by candlelight, his hand cramping as he documented every measurement, every lesson learned, every failure, every small success. He drew diagrams with the precision of an engineer and wrote notes with the passion of a man who needed someone, someday, to understand what they'd attempted. He sealed everything in a metal box and placed it beside the vehicle. At dawn, American tanks rolled through Caltanissetta, their engines loud and confident. The 8 Italians walked out to meet them, hands raised in the universal gesture of surrender, just another unit capitulating to the inevitable. The American soldiers were young, tired, but victorious. They processed the Italians efficiently, professionally, another task in a long list of tasks. But in the hills, hidden in darkness and silence, the camionetta veloce waited. It waited as a monument to ambition that exceeded resources, to pride that outlasted defeat, to the stubborn human insistence on trying even when trying seems futile. It waited for someone to find it, someone to understand it, someone to learn from what 8 men had attempted in a barn while their world collapsed around them. August 17th, 1943. The prisoner of war camp sprawled across a field near Palermo, row after row of tents surrounded by wire fencing that didn't need to be particularly strong. Most men here had no intention of escaping. They were simply tired, relieved to be done with fighting, waiting for whatever came next. Franco Bassetti sat in the dust, surrounded by thousands of Italian soldiers. The Americans processed them efficiently, almost kindly, with a bureaucratic competence that seemed to characterize everything they did. They gave them food, bland but plentiful. They gave them water, clean and cold. They gave them cigarettes, American brands that tasted harsh compared to Italian tobacco. The treatment was correct, professional, nothing like the stories of German or Japanese camps that would emerge later. These Americans wanted to get the Italians processed, catalogued, and sent home as quickly as possible so they could focus on the real enemy to the north. One American officer walked past, clipboard in hand, and Franco saw what he was driving, a jeep, identical to the one they'd captured nearly a month ago. It moved effortlessly through the camp, engine purring with that distinctive sound Franco had come to know so well, carrying supplies, carrying officers, carrying the weight of a war machine that never seemed to break down. The officer steered with one hand, relaxed, confident, the vehicle responding to his touch with precision. It climbed a small rise without the engine note even changing, then accelerated smoothly on the level ground. Franco watched it disappear between the tents, that olive-green shape that represented everything he'd tried and failed to recreate. Pietro Vella sat beside Franco, following his gaze. The young man, just 19 years old, looked older now, weathered by experiences that had compressed years into weeks. "It's not fair, is it?" he said quietly. "No," Franco said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But war never is." He continued to stare at the spot where the jeep had disappeared, seeing in his mind's eye the camionetta veloce, their desperate copy hidden in a cave in the hills. Nothing about war is fair. Not who has the resources, not who has the factories, not who has the technology. War is the most unfair competition humanity has ever devised. "Do you think?" Pietro hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Do you think what we built mattered? Even if it never worked? Even if it could barely run?" Franco was silent for a long moment. Around them, thousands of conversations created a low hum of Italian voices. Men discussing homes they hadn't seen in years, families they wondered about, futures that had become suddenly uncertain. Finally, Franco smiled, just slightly, the first genuine smile Pietro had seen on his face in weeks. "We took the most advanced vehicle in the world," he said slowly, "with no blueprints, no proper tools, no materials worth mentioning. We had scrap metal from broken trucks, parts from a destroyed motorcycle, an engine that was designed for a vehicle half the weight, and we made something that ran." He turned to look at Pietro directly. It couldn't match 100 kilometers per hour. It could barely reach 35. It could barely climb a hill. But it ran. We turned it on, and it ran. That's not nothing. That's engineering. That's human ingenuity, refusing to accept limitations. Gianni Torrisi joined them, moving through the crowd with the careful steps of a man whose legs had gone stiff from sitting too long. He was holding a tin cup of American coffee, the bitter liquid still steaming in the afternoon heat. "The guards say Italy will probably surrender soon," he said, settling down beside them with a grunt. "Maybe weeks, maybe days. They're just waiting for Rome to make it official." "Then what?" Pietro asked, the question carrying the weight of a generation that had known nothing but war and fascism and now faced a future with neither. "What happens to us? What happens to Italy?" "Then we go home," Stefano Marelli said, appearing from the crowd like a ghost materializing from memory. Their captain looked thinner, more weathered, but his eyes still carried that quiet authority that had kept them together through impossible circumstances. He sat down with them, completing their small circle. "And we rebuild, not with what we wish we had, but with what we have. That's always been the Italian way, hasn't it? We've been invaded, conquered, divided, and reunited more times than any nation in Europe. And each time, we rebuild." He looked at the three men, these soldiers who had become something more than soldiers in that barn outside Caltanissetta. They'd become partners in creation, brothers in failure, witnesses to each other's determination. And maybe, someday, someone will build a vehicle as good as that Jeep. But it'll be an Italian who builds it, using everything we learned in that barn, using our failures as lessons, using our desperate improvisation as inspiration. Franco leaned back, closing his eyes against the sun. "Do you really believe that? That what we did matters? That some future Italian engineer will benefit from our failure?" "I have to believe it," Stefano said quietly, "because the alternative is accepting that everything we did was meaningless. And I refuse to accept that. We tried." In the middle of a collapsing war, with our country falling apart, with defeat staring us in the face, we tried to build something better. That attempt, that refusal to give up, that matters. It has to matter. The weeks passed slowly in the camp. August turned to September. On September 8th, Italy officially surrendered, and the announcement came over loudspeakers in Italian and English. Some men cheered, some wept. Most simply nodded, accepting what they'd known was coming for months. The war for Italy was over, though the war in Italy would continue for another year and a half as the Germans fought a bitter retreat up the peninsula. By October, the Americans began releasing prisoners, sending them home in batches as transportation became available. Franco, Pietro, Gianni, and Stefano were processed together, given papers, given directions, and sent north toward homes they hadn't seen in over a year. They travelled by train, by truck, by foot, through an Italy that looked ravaged and exhausted. Cities were bombed, bridges were destroyed, fields lay fallow, but people were already rebuilding, already clearing rubble, already planting seeds for next year's harvest. They parted ways in Rome, each heading to different regions, different lives. They promised to stay in touch, to remember what they'd built together. Pietro went south to his family's farm in Calabria. Gianni returned to Milan to find his factory job waiting, the Fiat plant damaged but already beginning repairs. Stefano went home to his small town near Florence, to a wife who'd thought him dead and children who barely remembered their father. Franco returned to Turin, to streets he'd walked as a young man, now lined with rubble. He found work at the same factory where he'd learned his trade, and he threw himself into rebuilding Italian automotive engineering. He never spoke about the camionetta veloce. It was a secret he carried, a memory of 3 weeks when he'd tried to copy perfection and learned humility instead. The years passed. Italy rebuilt with the Marshall Plan money that flooded in from America, the same America that had defeated them. The irony wasn't lost on Franco. Italian factories rose from the ruins, modern factories with new equipment, new techniques, new ambitions. Fiat, Alfa Romeo, Lancia, these names became synonymous with style and innovation. Italian engineers learned from German precision and American mass production, synthesizing the best of both into something uniquely Italian. Franco married, had children, grew old. He never forgot the camionetta veloce, but he never returned to Sicily to look for it. Some memories were meant to stay buried, he thought. Some failures were private, sacred in their privacy. Spring, 1965, 22 years after the war ended, a young engineering student named Marco Torrisi, grandson of Gianni, was hiking in the hills near Caltanissetta, researching a thesis on wartime innovation. His grandfather had told him stories, vague references to something built in a barn, but Gianni had refused to give details. Some things are better left in the past, he'd said. But Marco was young, curious, determined to uncover the truth. He found the cave almost by accident, following a reference in an old partisan diary that mentioned supplies hidden in limestone caverns. Inside, beneath 22 years of dust and forgotten war, sat something impossible, a vehicle. Italian-made, clearly, but shaped like the American jeeps he'd seen in newsreels and history books. Rusted, faded, the tires rotted away, but still intact. The chassis was rough, hand-welded, clearly made with improvised tools. The engine, when he opened the hood, was a Fiat design, modified in ways he'd never seen. Beside it, wrapped in deteriorating canvas, was a metal box. Marco pried it open with trembling hands. Inside, drawings. Specifications, technical diagrams drawn with meticulous care. And a journal, the pages yellowed but still legible, written in his grandfather's handwriting. He sat there on the cave floor, read every page, his flashlight cutting through the darkness, tears streaming down his face as he understood what these men had tried to do. We could not match their speed, the final entry read. We could not match their power. We could not match their resources, but we matched their ambition. We refused to accept defeat until defeat was absolute. We built something from nothing because building is what we do, what we are. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps trying is its own victory. Marco carefully photographed everything. He documented the camionetta from every angle, filled 3 notebooks with measurements and observations. Then he carefully loaded the journal and technical drawings into his bag and walked back to Palermo. He didn't touch the vehicle itself. Some monuments are meant to stay where they are, silent witnesses to forgotten struggles. 3 years later, Marco graduated from the Politecnico di Torino with highest honours. His thesis? Post-war Italian automotive. Engineering. Became required reading. In his acknowledgements, he mentioned 8 men who once tried to copy a Jeep in a barn during the darkest days of the war. He didn't name them, honouring their desire for privacy, but he described their attempt in detail, analysing what they'd learned, what mistakes they'd made, what innovations they'd discovered in their desperation. By 1970, Italy's automotive industry was booming, competing globally, proving that Italian engineering could match anyone. And somewhere in a museum in Turin, in a small corner dedicated to wartime innovation, sits a faded photograph of a strange vehicle, half Italian, half American, wholly impossible, with a plaque that reads, Camionetta Veloce, 1943. Prototype, built from captured American Jeep, maximum speed, 35 kilometers per hour. Never entered production. A testament to Italian ingenuity in impossible circumstances. No one who visits stops to read it. Why would they? It's a failed copy of a better machine. But Marco Torrisi stops there every year, on August 3rd, and thinks about 8 men in a barn who refuse to stop trying, even when everything said they should. And he smiles. Because speed isn't everything. Sometimes the attempt is the victory. Sometimes trying is enough. Spring, 1965. The hills near Caltanissetta wore their spring colours like a celebration. Wildflowers carpeting the slopes in purple and yellow, the air carrying the scent of thyme and rosemary. A young engineering student named Marco Torrisi, 23 years old, and full of the kind of determination that characterised his generation, was hiking through these hills with a purpose. He was the grandson of Giovanni Torrisi, the man everyone called Gianni, a retired factory worker who now spent his days tending a small garden in Milan and refusing to talk about the war. Marco had been researching a thesis on wartime innovation, trying to understand how Italian engineers had improvised and adapted under impossible circumstances, and his grandfather had let slip something during a family dinner the previous Christmas. Just a fragment, really, a few words about a barn and a captured vehicle and an attempt that had failed. When Marco pressed for details, Gianni had gone quiet, that particular silence that meant a story was buried too deep to easily retrieve. Some things are better left in the past, he'd said, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he reached for his wine glass. But Marco was young, curious, armed with the stubborn persistence of youth that refuses to let mysteries remain unsolved. He'd spent 3 months tracking down the story. He'd interviewed former soldiers, read through military archives, followed leads that mostly went nowhere. One old partisan, a man named Salvatore who lived in a crumbling farmhouse outside Enna, had mentioned supplies hidden in limestone caves during the occupation. He'd drawn Marco a rough map with arthritic fingers, marking locations with an X, the way treasure maps did in children's stories. Check the northern ridge, Salvatore had said. We used those caves for everything. Ammunition, food, stolen equipment. Who knows what's still up there, forgotten by time. Marco found the cave almost by accident. He'd checked 3 others already, finding nothing but bat droppings and empty darkness. But this 4th cave, partially hidden by an overgrowth of wild olive trees, had something different. The entrance had been deliberately obscured, branches arranged to conceal rather than growing naturally. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness as he stepped inside, and there, beneath 22 years of dust and forgotten war, sat something impossible. A vehicle. Italian-made, clearly, from the roughness of the construction, but shaped like the American Jeeps he'd seen in newsreels and history books. Rusted, faded from olive green to a mottled brown-grey, the canvas top rotted away to tatters, but still fundamentally intact. The frame was hand-welded. He could see that immediately, each joint showing the marks of manual work rather than factory precision. The wheels had no tires, just bare rims sitting on the cave floor. The steering wheel, he noticed with a strange pang, had come from something else entirely, probably a bus, its larger diameter looking awkward in the military vehicle's frame. Marco stood there for a long moment, his flashlight beam travelling over every detail, his engineer's mind already analysing what he was seeing. Then he noticed the metal box beside the vehicle, wrapped in deteriorating canvas that crumbled at his touch. His hands trembled as he pried open the lid. Inside, protected from moisture by the cave's dry air, were drawings, specifications, technical diagrams drawn with meticulous care on graph paper that had yellowed but remained legible, and a journal, its leather cover cracked and faded, filled with dense handwriting that he recognized immediately. His grandfather's handwriting. Marco sat down on the cave floor, his back against the cool limestone wall, and began to read. The flashlight created a small circle of light in the darkness, and within that circle, the past came alive. His grandfather's words, written in 1943, described everything: the capture of the American Jeep in the dead of night, the desperate decision to copy it, the names of the 8 men involved: Capitano Stefano Marelli, Tenente Franco Bassetti, Sergente Giovanni Torrisi, Caporale Pietro Vella, and 4 others whose names Marco wrote down carefully. The measurements they'd taken, the components they'd studied, the impossible task they'd set themselves. The journal detailed every step of construction, the sourcing of parts from wrecked vehicles, the welding of the chassis in a converted barn, the adaptation of a Fiat 1.1-litre engine that could never match the American original's 60 horsepower, the test drive that had ended in heartbreak, the vehicle barely reaching 35 kilometers per hour, unable to climb even gentle hills. And then, most movingly, the decision not to destroy it but to preserve it, to hide it as evidence that they had tried. The final entry, written in August 1943, just before the Americans arrived, made Marco's eyes blur with tears. We could not match their speed. His grandfather had written in a hand that showed fatigue and stress. We could not match their power. We could not match their resources or their industrial capacity. But we matched their ambition. We refused to accept defeat until defeat was absolute. We built something from nothing because building is what we do, what we are, what makes us human, and perhaps that is enough. Perhaps the attempt itself is the victory. Perhaps trying, in the face of certain failure, is the most human thing we can do. Marco sat there for more than an hour, reading every page twice, studying every diagram, understanding for the first time what his grandfather had carried silently for 22 years. When he finally stood, his legs stiff from sitting on cold stone, he knew what he had to do. He carefully photographed everything. The vehicle from every angle, showing the hand-welded chassis, the improvised components, the desperate ingenuity. The diagrams, each page photographed twice to ensure clarity. The journal, every page captured on film. He loaded the original documents into his hiking bag with the reverence of an archaeologist handling ancient scrolls. But he left the vehicle itself exactly where it was. Some monuments, he understood instinctively, are meant to stay where they are, silent witnesses to struggles that deserve to be remembered but not disturbed. He walked back to Palermo as the sun was setting, his mind spinning with possibilities. That evening, from his cheap student lodging, he called his grandfather. "Nonno," he said quietly, "I found it. I found the camionetta." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then his grandfather's voice, thick with emotion, said simply, "Then you know." They talked for 2 hours, Gianni finally opening up about those 3 weeks in 1943, about the hope and the failure, and the decision to preserve rather than destroy. "I've carried that with me my whole life," Gianni said. "The shame of failure, but also the pride of trying." "Does that make sense?" Marco assured him it made perfect sense. 3 years later, in 1968, Marco graduated from the Politecnico di Torino with highest honours. His thesis, titled Post-War Italian Automotive Engineering, Lessons from Failure and the Value of Impossible Attempts, became required reading in engineering programs across Italy. He analysed the camionetta veloce in technical detail, explaining exactly why it had failed, why Italian industry in 1943 couldn't match American capabilities, but also what the attempt revealed about Italian ingenuity, determination, and the refusal to accept limitations. In his acknowledgements, he mentioned 8 men who once tried to copy a Jeep in a barn during the darkest days of the war. He didn't name them at first, honouring their desire for privacy, but he described their attempt with the kind of respect usually reserved for successful innovations. By 1970, Italy's automotive industry was booming in ways that would have seemed impossible in 1943. Fiat was producing hundreds of thousands of vehicles annually. Alfa Romeo was winning racing championships. Lancia was pioneering new technologies. Italy had become one of the world's leading automotive nations, and Italian design was synonymous with style and innovation. The country that had failed to copy a Jeep in wartime was now exporting cars across the globe, competing with America and Germany on equal terms. Marco, now working as an automotive engineer for Fiat, arranged for a special exhibition. He worked with the museum in Turin, one of the city's smaller institutions dedicated to industrial history. In a corner dedicated to wartime innovation, he created a display. He couldn't bring the actual camionetta from the cave. It was too fragile, too historically significant to move. But he had the photographs, enlarged and mounted. He had copies of the technical drawings, framed and displayed with proper lighting. And he had his grandfather's journal, the original now preserved in a climate-controlled case, opened to that final entry about matching ambition. The plaque he wrote himself, working through a dozen drafts before finding the right words. Camionetta Veloce, 1943. Prototype. Built from captured American Jeep by 8 Italian soldiers during the invasion of Sicily. Maximum speed, 35 kilometers per hour. Never entered production. Built with salvaged parts, improvised tools, and determination in the face of certain failure. A testament to Italian ingenuity in impossible circumstances. No one who visits the museum stops to read it. Why would they? The display is in a back corner, easy to miss. The photograph shows a crude, rusty vehicle that obviously failed. It's not a success story. It's not a triumph of engineering. It's a failed copy of a better machine, evidence of Italian inadequacy compared to American industrial might. Tourists walk past without a second glance, heading toward the displays of sleek Ferraris and elegant Lancias, the proof of Italy's eventual success. But Marco Torrisi stops there every year, on August 3rd, the anniversary of the day his grandfather and 7 other men hid their creation in a cave. He stands alone in the quiet museum, looking at the photograph of that impossible vehicle, and he thinks about 8 men in a barn who refused to stop trying, even when everything said they should. He thinks about his grandfather, who carried the memory of that failure and that attempt for his entire life. He thinks about the difference between success and significance, between winning and trying, between triumph and dignity. And he smiles, because he understands now, with the wisdom that comes from studying engineering and history and human nature, that speed isn't everything, power isn't everything, success isn't everything. Sometimes the attempt is the victory. Sometimes trying in the face of certain failure is more important than succeeding when success is easy. Sometimes 8 men in a barn with nothing but scrap metal and hope can create something that matters more than 1,000 factory-perfect vehicles, because they prove that the human spirit refuses to accept limitations, refuses to surrender to despair, refuses to stop building even when building seems futile. That, Marco thinks, is what makes us human. That is what makes us Italian. That is what makes us worth remembering. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.